Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's May 30th, 2025. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness. We're going to get started with a few taboo topics. One of the great things about the internet, one of the many great things, is that it allows ready, easy access to primary source documents. Often documents, news articles, pamphlets, things that have been lost to the mists of history, where they were maybe printed on paper in some magazine at the time, and that magazine went defunct, and nobody has seen these documents for decades. And because of the internet, they're scanned and disseminated widely. And so now, instead of reading about somebody's perception or description of the history or what people thought at the time in the past, you can actually read what they thought and read the words for themselves rather than have it filtered through a biased source. And so in that spirit, I kind of randomly came across something I had never heard of, and I'm guessing most people have not heard of it. It is an 1863 Miscegenation Pamphlet. And so I'm going to give a bit of background on this pamphlet. It's actually the origin of the word miscegenation. This pamphlet coined that term. It's from 1863, so amidst the American Civil War, a controversial pamphlet titled Miscegenation, the Theory of the Blending of the Races Applied to the American White Man and Negro, was anonymously published in New York. It was attributed to abolitionist thinkers, and the pamphlet appeared to promote racial integration, interracial marriage, and the mixing of black and white Americans as a moral and biological imperative. But in reality, it was a hoax. It was a piece of political propaganda authored by Democratic journalists, big D Democrats and the Democratic Party, Democratic journalists David Goodman Crowley and George Waitman. Its purpose was to embarrass Republicans and the Lincoln administration by falsely portraying them as radical proponents of racial intermarriage, knowing this would offend many northern and border state whites. And so it's important to recognize that even the most liberal abolitionists of the time would be horrified by the idea of racial mixing, would never advocated that whites and blacks should be able to marry or to live together. In fact, something else I learned fairly recently was that when Oregon first became a state, they had a law that forbid black people to even be present in the state of Oregon altogether. So they didn't have slavery, they outlawed slavery, but they also outlawed black people even being present in the state of Oregon. And of course, Oregon, I don't know about at the time when it became a state in the mid 1800s, but it certainly is today seen as a progressive state. So anyway, back to the pamphlet. The idea of the pamphlet was to portray white abolitionists who were genuinely opposed to racial mixing and miscegenation. They were just opposed to slavery, but they weren't for race mixing. But this pamphlet attempted to portray the abolitionist position as synonymous with race mixing. And so the pamphlet coined the term miscegenation, which was a word derived from the Latin word miscere, to mix, and genus, or race or stock. And so this document, although it was a fabrication, it was not written in good faith. It did enter into the common usage the word miscegenation, and that term you see all over the segregationist laws of the late 1800s, early 1900s, the Jim Crow laws, the laws against white and black people marrying. The term miscegenation is used ubiquitously. And so I think the pamphlet is worth seeking out and reading if you're interested, but I'm going to go through a few excerpts from the pamphlet. So, quote, miscegenation is as inevitable as the course of the stars. The black man and the white man were created for each other. Their union will solve the great problem of the age. Another quote, the day is not distant when a fair young Anglo-Saxon bride shall lean upon the arm of a dark-skinned husband, and when the community shall applaud the union. And the political part comes in with this quote, it is the Republican Party which must take up the cause of miscegenation and carry it to glorious triumph. Another quote, Quote, whatever of power and vitality there is in the American race is derived, not from its Anglo-Saxon progenitors, but from all the different nationalities which go to make up this people. All that is needed to make us the finest race on earth is to engraft upon our stock the Negro element which Providence has placed by our side on this continent. And so it's interesting reading this pamphlet. Many of the ideas and the quotes really do genuinely sound unironically like the things that started, I would say, being said in earnest in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And even today, a lot of this stuff, you could, like I said, read it at face value and it would not sound out of place in today's world. But it was written in an ironic, not in good faith way back in the 1860s because it was seen accurately by the Democrats that these ideas would scare away even the most liberal, progressive people of the time.
One immediate broader point that jumps out is that of the slippery slope argument winning again. This is an illustration, one that history is littered with, and almost invariably it is the broader meta point of the historical narrative of the Western world, at least from the Enlightenment onward, where the ratchet turns always in the direction of more and more permissiveness and less reliance on what was previously held to be conventional wisdom that was so obvious that it didn't even need to be apologized for, and arguing against it, arguing for some change, was taken at face value as an absurd thing at the time, and then at some point in the future, it became something that was standard and accepted. This is a circuitous way of pointing out that the modern quip that conservatism is progressivism moving at the speed limit or something to that effect is not a new idea at all. It's accelerated now, where things that seemed unimaginable 5 years ago are accepted and celebrated in the present. But something like miscegenation, it took closer to 100 years for that to gain widespread acceptance. But now being against it is what is considered totally beyond the pale. I've mentioned it before too, but I think it is a helpful rule of thumb to think about during the 19th century, the Civil War era of American history, that the baseline assumption of the North was that of white nationalism, and that the baseline assumption of the Confederacy, of the American South, was white supremacy. And Abraham Lincoln famously argued that after the conclusion of the war, that the thing that would make the most sense would be to take the just liberated slaves in America and send them back to sub-Saharan Africa to create, or in Liberia, to create a society that constitutionally mirrored that of the United States, but that was separate. Those two terms are used as pejoratives interchangeably today, that of white nationalism and white supremacy, but they are very clearly distinct. In the case of white nationalism, it is what Oregon was, which was the progressive, less conservative position at the time, the idea that there should be separation rather than that there should be some sort of hierarchical structure, racially hierarchical structure existing like there was in the American South at the time. The pamphlet that Jeff excerpted from was published in 1863. Gallup has polling on American public support for interracial marriage, and in 1969, so that's over a century after the pamphlet was written, among American whites, just 17% approved of interracial marriage. That steadily increased over time, but not as rapidly as it might seem today, when it seems like a foregone conclusion that anyone who wasn't born in the Stone Age would be totally in favor or accepting of interracial marriage. But even in the 90s, in 1994, just 45% of white Americans approved of interracial marriage. In 2009, only 75%. And now 2021, which is the last time that the survey was conducted by Gallup, it had gone up to 93%. So it's now almost completely accepted among whites. But that change is not one from the 19th century. That's a change that has blown up from the end of the 60s through the 2020s, so a generation or a generation and a half. And Gallup has also polled non-whites on the question. In 1969, 56% of non-whites answered in the affirmative that they were supportive of interracial marriage. So less than two generations ago, only half of non-whites approved of interracial marriage. So this isn't something that is inherently white supremacist in nature. It was something that, even with the obvious benefits that would accrue to a minority population being able to intermingle and intermarry with the majority population, it was only 1 in 2 effectively who believed in or supported the idea of it. And now that has, like the white percentage of support, has reach total population saturation, with 96% of non-whites supporting interracial marriage today. So now, again, to reiterate, in 2021, 93% of whites and 96% of non-whites approved of interracial marriage.
That's some pretty staggering statistics, Ness. I had no idea that the rates of acceptance of interracial marriage had changed so much. And when I heard you talk about that, I thought of this Muhammad Ali interview from 1971 that I've seen before. It came to mind. I'm going to play a little bit of that.
The thing, when you say integration, it comes under intermarriage too, right? All
right.
Been together.
Right, sure.
And I'm sure no intelligent white person watching this show, or no intelligent white man in his or her right white mind, want black boys and black girls marrying their white sons and daughters, and in return introducing their grandchildren as half-brown, kinky-haired black people.
I wouldn't object to that.
Well, you wouldn't, but a lot of them would.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people would. No, this is the point.
What I'm trying to say is this. And you don't have it. You say you don't, but you don't have it. You really ain't going to have it. You're on the show and you got to say that. But
that's not true.
Why would you want to do that?
Because I don't think I'm any different from you, you see.
Yeah, we much different.
I mean, I think society's made us different.
You know we're different. We all together.
But society's made us different.
No, not society. God made us different.
No, we're just human beings. He made all of us.
We all, listen, bluebirds fly with bluebirds, red birds want to be with red birds. Listen, tell me when I'm wrong. Pigeons want to be with pigeons.
But
tell
we
me
have
when I'm
intelligence.
wrong. We should have more, they don't have intelligence, but yet they stay together. We should have more intelligence than them, right? Buzzards are with buzzards. Yeah. Buzzards are with buzzards. Bluebirds are with bluebirds. They all are birds, but they got different cultures. The eagles like to hang out in the mountains. The buzzard like to fly around the desert.
Well,
the bluebird like to fly around the trees and the grass.
There'd be certain problems a buzzard mating with a sparrow, wouldn't there?
What?
There'd be certain...
Right. And we have the problems too.
No,
I don't see no black and white couples in England or America walking around proud holding their children.
That's because society...
And going out.
That's society's fault. We've got to educate people around it.
Well, life is too short for me to be raised catching hell for something like that. I'd rather go and be my own. Have a beautiful daughter, beautiful wife. They look like me. We're all happy and I don't have no trouble. I got no trouble. I ain't that much in love with no woman to go through all that hell. Ain't no one woman that good. You understand?
There are a lot of interesting things in that interview with Muhammad Ali. It's a classic. But as the polling we just talked about showed, that was a view that was mainstream enough among non-whites. Muhammad Ali was stating the orientation that about half of blacks at the time expressed, and one that the vast majority of whites did as well. One of the things that is a little bit humorous about that is that Muhammad Ali himself was probably, I would guess, 15 to 20% European by ancestry. That is something that is a little known fact, that blacks in America who are descended from slaves whose ancestors have been here nearly as long as whites whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower, that on average they are between 15 and 20% European by ancestry because of the miscegenation that occurred, the power dynamics that make that not especially surprising that it did. The dynamic was the one that is probably most salient with the controversy about Thomas Jefferson's and Sally Hemings. That was a dynamic that played out many times across America during the colonial period in American history. And given that fewer than 5% of white Americans owned slaves at any given time during their ancestral past, it leads to the somewhat uncomfortable conclusion today that Black Americans are far more likely to be descended from slave owners than white Americans are. And it's why Black Americans are, on average, noticeably much less dark than African immigrants to the United States from Nigeria and from Zimbabwe. Those sub-Saharan African immigrants are often joked about by Black Americans as being so dark that they're purple. And despite what the interviewer who was talking to Muhammad Ali had to say about that, that is not a social construct. That is a biological reality, and it manifests in many ways, including the physical appearance of Black Americans who are 15 to 20% European by ancestry, and how they are noticeably distinct from actual sub-Saharan Africans who are virtually entirely sub-Saharan African by ancestry. And I think we would be remiss too if we didn't take a moment to talk about the differences between stated preferences and revealed preferences, because even though an overwhelming majority of Americans of all racial backgrounds express public support for interracial marriage, the reality is that the vast majority of marriages in America today are not interracial. Among newlyweds in America today, 18% of Blacks are interracially married, and 11% of whites are interracially married. And given that Blacks are 13% of the general population, if marriages were totally random and irrespective of race, then we would expect that around 90%, close to 90% of Blacks would be interracially married. But the fact that just 18% of them are shows that even though the vast majority of people say that they are supportive of interracial marriage, when it comes to their own personal choices, the overwhelming majorities of people tend to stick within their own race. And for reasons that are not particularly difficult to grok. For example, it is something that most parents want. They want children that look like them. And since we're already so deep into this taboo topic, it might as well be pointed out that there are sex differences in terms of interracial marriage as well. Black men are more than twice as likely to be interracially married as Black women are. And in particular, when it comes to Black-white marriages, Black men are about 3 times as likely to marry white women as white men are to marry Black women. And a similar dynamic, although in the reverse with regards to whites, characterizes white-Asian marriages, where white men are about 3 times as likely to be married to Asian women as white women are to be married to Asian men. This leads in the dating market to a situation where Black men have the pick of the litter and Asian women have the pick of the litter, and the big losers in the interracial marriage market are Black women and Asian men. And it's not correspondingly difficult to find angry Black women talking about this and angry Asian men talking about it. And if we really want to get into controversial territory on a Philip Rushton scale of the 3 major races, this is not going to be that difficult to understand why Black men are the most sought after in terms of interracial marriage, and Black women are the least sought after, and correspondingly the Asian women are the most sought after and Asian men are the least sought after, because Black men tend to be the most masculine. Blacks tend to be the most masculine, traditionally understood, and Asians tend to be the most effeminate, traditionally understood, with whites somewhere in the middle, although generally closer to Asians on the Philip Rushton scale. And so Asian men being the most effete lose out, and black women, being the most masculine or least feminine, also lose out. Like the slippery slope argument winning again that I referenced earlier, this is an example of biological reality asserting itself and winning again.
Next, another primary source document I came across. This one is written by Marcus Eli Ravage, and his article is called A Real Case Against the Jews. So, Marcus Eli Ravage lived 1884 to 1965. He was a Romanian-born Jewish-American journalist, author, and political commentator. After immigrating to the United States in 1900, he became known for his writing on immigration, identity, and Jewish life. His autobiographical work, An American in the Making, published in 1917, chronicles his journey from a Romanian shtetl to American academia. Ravage contributed to a number of influential magazines, including The Century, Harper's, and The Nation. And so in January 1928, Ravage published an article in The Century magazine titled A Real Case Against the Jews. And this piece was supposedly written as ironic satire intended to mock and subvert anti-Semitic accusations. And I should say that it's not clear to me that that is the tone that it was written in, that it was written ironically, and I'm not sure that I think there's a case to be made that it was written in sincerity. I'm not sure it's fair to just declare that it's ironic satire, although that is the impression you'll get if you Google this this author and this work. But nonetheless, instead of defending Jews against common slanders, Ravage turned the accusation on its head, arguing that the real, quote, Jewish crime was revolutionizing Western civilization itself. This idea gets at something we've discussed in the past on the Reality Taboo, the nature, the origin of Christianity, and how it's Semitic and came from the Levant. And as we discussed last week, Ness pointed out that while it's not Christianity didn't originate from the core of the Roman Empire, the heart of Europe, it's probably more accurate to say it developed on the fringes. And this article looks at that topic as from a different angle. So Ravage claimed that Jews had reshaped the moral, religious, and cultural fabric of the West, not through conspiracy or finance, but through the introduction of Christianity, the transmission of biblical ethics, and the disruption of pagan traditions. His point was that Jews, through Jesus, Paul, and the Hebrew prophets, had imposed a new moral order on Europe. And again, the narrative surrounding this article, well, first of all, the main approach to this article is just to ignore it, and that's why I've never heard of it, and I doubt most Americans have heard of it. But if it is brought up at all, it's presented as satire, misinterpreted, and misappropriated by anti-Semites. And so the idea is that this was written as satire. The only people who would be interested in it would be anti-Semites. And so the Nazis republished it, supposedly without context or without irony, to promote the myth of Jewish world domination, and it continues to circulate today in extremist circles. And so I'm going to read a couple quotes from it. This is a much shorter piece than the Miscegenation Pamphlet we discussed previously. So here's a quote from the Marcus Eli Ravage's A Real Case Against the Jews. Quote, "We have imposed upon you our ideals. Our tribal customs have become the core of your moral code. Our legends and folk tales are the sacred lore which you nurse with the greatest reverence. Our national history has become an indispensable part of the learning of your pastors and priests and scholars. Our kings, our statesmen, our soldiers are your heroes. Our old obscure rabbis are your saints. You Christians don't know it, but you are so entirely Jewish that even your dissenting sects and heresies are but the very thinnest disguises." Another quote from the piece, "Is it any wonder you resent us? We have put a clog upon your progress. We have imposed upon you an alien book and an alien faith which you cannot digest, which is at cross purposes with your native spirit, which keeps you everlasting ill at ease, and which you lack the spirit to either reject or accept in full.
When evaluating claims like this, assertions like this, I like to take immediate big picture tests to see if the assertion being made survives the rigor. And the first thing that comes up here, obviously, is that why after 2,000 years, when we look at, say, the General Social Survey, the beliefs held by Jews in America or Jews in other places in the Western world are so distinct from the views held by non-Jews. For example, if we take a question like abortion, according to the General Social Survey in the United States, we see that 80% of Jews support a woman having an abortion for any reason whatsoever. So this is the most permissive definition, the most ultimate pro-choice position that you can have. This is a woman going up to 8.5 months and just deciding that I don't really want to raise a child anymore. I have other things I want to do, and it doesn't matter if the father of the child objects. It doesn't matter if there are adoption availability agencies, if there are options in that regard. This is just if the woman decides for whatever reason she wants to have an abortion, she should be able to have it. And 80% of Jews support that compared to just 36% of Protestants and 37% of Catholics. And those are modern numbers. So this is after this attempt to combine the value systems of Jews and non-Jews. Over 2,000 years, we have this vastly different view of a fundamental understanding of human nature. What Marcus Eli Ravage is claiming here is something that, say, Kevin McDonald would be simpatico on. And when it comes to Kevin McDonald, who has given a more rigorous scholarly defense for the case that Eli Ravage is making here, a couple of questions that I have immediately come to mind that I don't think Kevin McDonald is able to answer is, one, why, if Jewish values over time are a kin selection strategy, why are half of Jews today marrying non-Jews? So the dilution of Judaism is happening at a rapid rate in the Western world, for one, and then two, why are Jewish fertility rates in the Western world so below replacement? And so while I think it is interesting, if it can't meet these obvious immediate hurdles, it's hard to take it seriously, at least as a holistic explanation for why things have turned out the way that they have.
I'm not taking a firm position on the Kevin McDonald culture of critique idea that Judaism, looking at Judaism through the lens of an evolutionary kin selection strategy. So whether this was a plan all along by Jewish people to increase their progeny, I don't really know enough about that. I'm simply saying that Christianity, properly understood, is really just a subset, an outgrowth of Judaism, and perhaps I'd go so far as to call it not a new religion. It's just one of many of the sects of the time, of the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Christians. In fact, that's, I believe, how it was seen in the early days of Christianity. It was viewed as another offshoot or another sect within Judaism.
Well, yeah, they wouldn't be referred to as Jews or Judaism. That would be a little bit anachronistic, but I get what you're saying. They'd be various sects of the Hebrew religion at the time. And I should point out, too, that the Kevin McDonald point was not to say that these things there is some overlap, but I'm not trying to make the argument necessarily that Eli Ravage and Kevin McDonald believe exactly the same thing. I was using that as another example of how I like to, when I hear assertions that are revisionist in nature, I like to put them through an immediate gauntlet where my metric is, if this had explanatory value, would these obvious factors that blatantly contradict it be in place or not? And so if Jewish kin selection has been a successful evolutionary strategy, then either it was at some point and no longer is, or it never was in the first place because of the fact that, given what Kevin MacDonald would assert to be Jewish values being dominant in the Western world, while contemporary Jews outmarry at massively high rates and have below replacement fertility, well, that doesn't seem like it's a very successful kin selection strategy. And I may not be getting Jeff's point exactly. I suppose if the purpose of what Eli Ravitch wrote was to say that Christianity is an Abrahamic faith, well, then the same question has to be applied to Islam, which came from, it would also could be perceived as a Jewish sect centuries removed.
Of course, you're right that Islam is an Abrahamic religion too, and that it is closely related to Judaism through Ishmael and the descendants of Abraham. I would just argue that if you're comparing the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there is a much closer, tighter relationship between Christianity and Judaism than there is between Islam and Judaism. And that difference would be both in terms of time. Islam was centuries after Christianity. It was much farther away. It was in Arabia. It was a different racial group speaking a different language, Arabic, and the customs are just on the surface there's so much more of a gulf between Islam and Christianity and Judaism than there is between, the gulf is much greater than the gulf between Christianity and Judaism. And again, another point I want to make is what we call Judaism, or what at the time of Jesus was called, they would have been, Jews would have been called Hebrews. None of this is static. These traditions and faiths are continuously changing. And so Judaism, what it was at the time of Jesus, Judaism continued to evolve on its own track and changed dramatically and continued to diverge from Christianity. But the fact is, Christianity was an offshoot, just like there were many offshoots throughout the history of Judaism. Christianity was just an offshoot at a particular time, and it started as a sect of Judaism, and then as Judaism continued to evolve and change, Christianity did as well, and they continued to diverge and became quite more and more different. But again, to me, that doesn't discount the common origins of the two.
Yeah, so I guess I had said that the point I'm taking from this is that they are both, Christianity and Judaism, are Abrahamic faiths, and I guess you could say too that to maybe simplify it even more and sound a little less pretentious, we're stating that modern Jews and modern Christians both believe in the Old Testament, and therefore the case that Christians today would have against Jews is the fact that they both believe in the Old Testament. I'm having trouble, other than this just being an interesting historical anecdote, I'm having trouble with understanding what point Jeff is trying to make, if he's trying to make a point, if there is a point to be made here. But the historical Christian response to this, although it will not be so recognized or recognizable by contemporary Americans, given the course of Christianity over the last 150 years, but the understanding of Christianity over its first 1,800 years of existence was that this was the truth. These are not, Christianity isn't an offshoot of Judaism. It is simply a true interpretation of humanity's story going all the way back to the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve, and that if anything, Jews deserve special condemnation because they had revelation made most obvious to them earliest in time and rejected it, or at least some subset of people living in the Levant rejected it, but the true believers who understood God and what the purpose of revelation was in God's sacrifice, that they subsequently inherited the earth. If the criticism is of historical Christianity up to that point, that makes more sense to me, that Eli Ravitch is not criticizing the modern Western world, but is instead criticizing the persecution that Jews had faced over the last 1800 years at the hands of Christianity, Christians and Christianity, and that in some sense Christians are actually the ultimate example of a self-hating Jew. That, I suppose, in the historical context makes more sense, because this was when Eli Ravage lived, we were just getting to the dawn of the marrying of Judaism and Christianity in the way that it is often conceived today, especially in America, and that modern conception is distinct from, again, the first 1800 years of Christianity's existence. And so I suppose in some ways, Jeff just said to me, we weren't recording, that maybe Eli Ravage is like the first Christ cuck.
You often see at bookstores, especially in the age of Trump and the age of Ron DeSantis in Florida, who's supposedly banning books, or at least limiting certain books' availability in public school libraries. So with that context, you see mostly people on the left pretend like there's censorship coming from the right, that the right is banning books. And so to fight this supposed menace, you'll see displays at bookstores and library of banned books. You'll see books on there, pretty innocuous books like 1984 or Fahrenheit 451 or The Handmaid's Tale, books that supposedly the right-wingers don't want you to read because they're too dangerous. They're too, and so you should you should fight the authority, fight the man by reading these books that they don't want you to read. And implicitly, they are advocating, they're railing against censorship, and that Americans should be able to read whatever they choose, and there shouldn't be right-wing reactionaries who try to prevent them from reading these books and being exposed to these ideas. Now, if that was a true principle, in my opinion, there would be alongside, 1984 and Fahrenheit 451 and those books, and To Kill a Mockingbird, books like that have been banned in America at certain times in certain places. And so by all means, have those books displayed. But to be consistent with that moral principle against censorship, you should also have pamphlets like these two that we discussed from Eli Ravage, and this pamphlet on miscegenation, and for that matter, Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler, or works by eugenicists of the early 20th century like Madison Grant or even Charles Darwin. All those kinds of things should be displayed in these banned book section, but of course they're not. And those same people would have no issue whatsoever with banning the two works that we discussed on this episode.
The thing about banned books is so difficult to take seriously intellectually, and it's not really meant to be taken seriously. There are tens of millions of books that have been published just in the last 2 centuries, so the ability to display all of them in any single location is a logistical impossibility, and there is no demand being made that these books not be available in any context. In the case of Florida, it is that elementary and middle school and even high schools should not have certain sets of books allowed for display in those particular contexts. Not that the books be banned, that they not be accessible anywhere else. Just the idea that you have a section of a bookstore that allegedly pushes banned books, or a library that pushes banned books, is a logical contradiction, because if the books were banned, they wouldn't be permitted to be displayed there unless that display was some sort of flagrant violation of the law. But that's not the case, and it's not the case that anyone is even claiming. And the same people who fancy themselves champions of putatively banned books are going to be the same people who say that it is a state responsibility to regulate hate speech. The people who make the stink about, again, allegedly banned books are the same people who support all kinds of censorship of ideas being available for public consumption. They are intentionally conflating for rhetorical purposes, the selection that publicly funded educational institutions, the curriculum that they decide, and what is available to the broader public. And there is, again, no push at all from any elected Republican politician to ban the purchase of any of these books that are ever displayed in these displays of allegedly banned books. It is difficult almost to articulate because the whole premise is just so obviously false. No one is promoting the banning of Huckleberry Finn, and to the extent that anyone is promoting the banning of truly controversial books, like, say, a book by Jared Taylor that can't be sold on Amazon, it's going to be these exact same people and not Ron DeSantis or any of his political allies. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.